In this video, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the model and controller parts of the MVC web application that we've built throughout this course. But what we're going to see is that, as last time, we had made the views a little more robust by bringing in jQuery and theming and made our system a lot more flexible and themed. There are a few more things that we can do with our models and controllers in order to make our system fully MVC compliant and thereby make our system a lot more robust, maintainable, scalable, and all the good things that we desire. So go ahead and load World Manager themed full MVC.war into the Eclipse environment, and that will bring up all the code. And what we'll notice right away is that there is a lot more going on the back end now. There are a lot more back-end classes. Now the reason for this is because I've essentially taken a lot of the control out of the servlet and placed that into the control of a manager. So the manager is going to be another model, but that model is simply more of a business logic model. This way we can bring the code out of the controller, out of the servlet, and allow the manager to do all of the database calls that are needed or interactions between different database objects or anything that we need to do in order to get the data. Now this is really nice because this means if we ever decide to change our database solution for some reason, our views and our controllers should not have to change as long as the calls to the model managers are still in place. And then that could take care of all the database interaction behind the scenes and make our application a lot easier to control or to maintain. We have different model managers that I've created here for the city, for the country languages, which we're not really even using at this point. The country manager, so that's our country data. So cities and countries are pretty important for what we've built so far. I made a web user manager so that we can take care of our interaction for login and validating web users. And then we have a cookie manager to get some of the control of the cookies out of the actual controller and into a common reusable format. Now the nice thing about moving into these model managers is they're very easy to test. Now I haven't set up any testing on this for the purposes of this course because we've already seen a little bit of testing and you could take it to the next level and add in tests on these models if you wanted to. But the nice thing about having them separated is now it is very easy to test a city manager to make sure that it's pulling the cities we want or inserting a city as expected. And that code can then be more robust and guaranteed to work. But what this also does is it makes our controllers a lot more lightweight, so this makes them easier to maintain as well. So bringing the controller down to its basic levels of what it needs to do, which is essentially interact between the view and the models, we take all the business logic and put that into the model manager, and the controller simply has to interact between the model manager, making the correct calls, and then pushing the information forward to the view, or taking information from the view and pushing it forward to the model manager. So the controller's only job then is what it's supposed to be, which is managing the flow of the application. So once we do this, we can see that our different code becomes a lot more lightweight. For example, getting city data. When we look at getting city data, before we had to pull from the database here, and now what we can do is actually just create a DB manager object, which is already in context, and a city manager object. And so the controller can invoke those objects as needed, but then it can make the correct call to get all the cities from the city manager and simply add that data and then move on. Now the controller doesn't care about how to connect to the database. All it needs to know is that the DB manager will handle that for it. And you can see that's already a lot more lightweight. Now the other nice thing about this is that, as we have seen before, when we added the city, we redirected into a servlet that then reset our data. But now if we remove all of that data building part from the controllers, all the controller needs to do is make the correct call. So rather than, when we get done adding a city, nullifying the session, sending on to a servlet, which then ultimately sends on to the list page, we can directly reset the data right here very easily in our add city controller and then just move on to the page we ultimately wanted. So there are a couple different ways in the city manager to get cities based on different overloaded methods that I made. But what I did was just left the one active that easily takes in the parameters, pulls out the city. Once we have all the cities here, we can rebuild that session item. This will include the one we just added, and we can add that right back into session rather than redirecting as before we had to direct to the get city data servlet, which then brought us back to list cities. Now we just go right to list cities with the refresh data. So it's really nice. So now we also see a lot easier to maintain routing, and all the different interactions that we have become a lot more manageable. Get country codes is going to do the same thing. It's just going to use models instead of having to actually pull from the database and direct on to the pages that it needs to go to. And it's really nice to have the cookie manager because it's very easy to store the cookies then in the response in a common way. We can do this over and over again from different controllers if we needed to. And also, more importantly, to pull or clear the information, we can very easily go to the cookie manager and clear these credentials out from any of our controls rather than just having all this code right on a servlet. once again, as we move stuff from one place to another, it becomes a lot easier to test. So you can see the value of making sure that your models simply model data. The model managers, which are a fat model, essentially help to manage the modeling and business logic. And then the controller simply makes the correct calls between the views, or the correct response, redirects or dispatch or whatever it needs to do to the view or from the view, and it puts that information into the correct calls in the model managers, which then handles all the database stuff or the business logic behind the scenes, sends back to the controller, which then sends back to the view. And thereby, we've maintained and achieved a fully compliant MVC web application. We still have all the other things that we've built before with the authorization filter. We have the ability to add cities, view cities, list cities, log in, just like we've seen before. So let's go ahead and just run it real quick, just make sure everything's still working and see that we haven't done anything as far as making the system functionality fail. But now we have all of our MVC web app in place. And of course, all of our theming is still there. And once again, we've just managed to make sure that all of our code has become a lot easier to maintain, test, and use throughout the rest of the life cycle of this application. And that concludes our look at the fully compliant MVC with models and lightweight controllers. And now all of our system has been completed with the views being themed, easily maintaining the data display on the page, and the models being completely segregated so that they're working as expected, and the controller simply doing controlling actions.